Well, good morning, everyone. I have something good to tell you. You probably already knew this, but Tara and I have four, and I'm going to put in this category, grown out of the house children. So it's a glorious thing. It's been a while. In fact, we had like 28 consecutive years with a kid in the house. And I had the realization that we had a lot of rules through the years. I mean, with little kids, you have like bedtime rules and different things like that. And as they got older, there was things like curfew, and then there's chores, and then there's expectations, and then there's responsibilities and consequences if they do not live up to rules or expectations or whatever it might be. And my kids did not always like the rules. And looking back, when I was a kid, I didn't like all my parents' rules. Sometimes thought they were stupid. But I kind of thought about that a little bit this week, thinking about the value of rules, the value of guardrails and boundaries that we have in life. And one of the basic premises of rules, of laws, is to save people from themselves. Like little kids, you put rules like you don't play in the street and you don't touch hot things. Why? Because you're wanting to save them from themselves. I think about traffic laws. Think about speed limits. I mean, I already think people drive like idiots. But if you took the guardrails off, if you took the boundaries off of the situation, it would be absolutely pandemonium. So rules really save us from ourselves. But there's also the fact, when I think about being a parent, now a grandparent, rules are an expression of love. Like, I love my kids. I love my grandkids. And because of that, there are guardrails, there's rules, there's boundaries in that. And as we've studied through the book of Exodus, we're kind of pivoting this week from what we've been doing over the last several weeks. Last several weeks, we've been talking about God acts, like God was moving in many ways to reveal himself and to show his power and his majesty in protecting his people and drawing them out of Egypt. But now we're moving into the part where God starts putting in the rules. And kind of like, if you're going to be the people of God, this is what it means to live within a certain parameters of being the people of God. Now, with that, I have to say that God has given us laws to protect us from ourselves. That without them, we would probably have a whole lot more mistakes made in our lives. I think his laws are an expression of his love. But again, he is taking a people who for 430 years basically did not have any laws. They did not have any restraints or boundaries. And now he's putting them in place. Now, we're going to look today at the first 10. But realize that God put in over 600 different laws and commands. Now, some people might ask, are people really that stupid that they needed that many laws? Yes. Are we that stupid that we need that many laws? The answer is yes. But I want to look at verses 1 and 2 of Exodus 20 because I think there's something here about just kind of unpacking this like a baseline here today. It says, "Then God gave the people all these instructions. I am the Lord your God who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery." Now, before we go any farther, I think it's important for us to understand God establishes his law based on him, based on his character. So every commandment flows from the identity, character, and actions of God. I was the one who brought you up out of Egypt. So since God is who God is, and he did what he did, these are the demands that he can put on our lives. And so let's look at verse 3. It says, "You must not have any other God but me." So basically, right out of the gate, he speaks about the who of worship. We are going to worship something, and he said that there is to be nothing else and no one else gets priority before God, and nothing else and no one else gets loyalty except God. But I also believe that God knew that as people, we will seek after surrogate gods, that we will create gods, that we will do things that limit or basically make our loyalty to Him as if it is no loyalty at all. So He says, me and only me. And so this is the who of worship. Now we start getting into a little bit of the how, and He actually speaks to the surrogate gods. In fact, notice verse 4, it says, you must not make for yourself an idol of any kind, or an image of anything in the heavens, or in the earth, or in the sea. You must not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, who will not tolerate affection for any other gods. I lay the sins of the parents upon their children. The entire family is affected, even children into the third and fourth generation of those who reject me. But I lavish unfailing love for 1,000 generations on those who love me and obey my commands. Now, an idol, in the strictest, simplest form, is a visible representation of the invisible. And so it's trying to put in our minds and in our eyes a visible expression of that. Now, when you think about this command right here, and you go to Exodus 35, it did not take them very long. In fact, in a matter of weeks, a matter of days, they said it's taken Moses too long up on the mountain, they created the golden calf. Now, we're going to talk about the golden calf and how that, in a future sermon, how that might actually have been them saying, God is a powerful God, God is an awesome God, God is an amazing God. Give us an idol that expresses that. But what happens in the meantime, it diminishes all the other aspects of God. And so with idolatry, it is an endless cycle that you got to create more idols. So you worship a god of power, there's the god of power. Then there's the god of the sun. Oh, and there's the god of the moon. And there's the god of fertility. And there's the god of rain and the god of sun. All of these different things have to become gods, which, we prayed for Central India mission here today. And you think about Hinduism, where many people have suggested that there's over 33,000 different gods. In fact, I used to coach upward basketball when my kids were little, and I had a kid on my team one year who was Indian, not Native American Indian, but Indian. And so I was talking to his dad one day, and I asked if they happened to go to Eastern Hills, which is where the basketball league was, and he goes, no, we're Hindu. We have our idols in our home. And it kind of struck me because I kind of like, that's not something that we think about. We don't have, like in our typical culture, like wooden or stone or metal objects that we worship. But I wonder if you take somebody from Israel during the time of the wanderings, and they understood what this actually meant, and you had them time travel to our time and our culture today, what would they call our idols? What would they say are the idols of our culture? And I just wonder if they would see a bunch of people carrying around these bad boys and go, what are these idols that everybody is focused on all the time? And so, like, for example, every Sunday morning at 9:05, I don't know why it's 9:05, but every Sunday morning at 9:05, I get a little buzz on my phone that lets me know how long I was on my idol this week. Okay? And then I would wonder if they heard us talk, and they while we watch TV and all these different things, if they would go, they have this strange affinity for the political culture in their society. Too soon? Too much of low-hanging fruit? I mean, the reality is that. Okay? So while we don't have the wooden objects of the past, we do. And so I'm going to ask what gets your time, what gets your thoughts, what makes you mad, what sets your mood, Okay, if your football team lost yesterday, maybe that's going to affect your mood. You saw all those different things. And so this kind of gets into like the what of worship, but now I want to get really into the how of worship. Notice verse 7, you must not misuse the name of the Lord your God. The Lord will not let you go unpunished if you misuse his name. So, quick, immediately, where does your mind go when you hear this command? Cussing. Okay, I kind of grew up with the idea, and this is how they would apply this. If you have a potty mouth, you're going to hell. Okay, that's just one of the things that we have done in our society and our culture, but there's something worse than profanity. What is worse than profanity is flippantly using the name of God. In fact, what it means here is you lift God's name up to emptiness. Basically, what Victor Hamilton said, who is an Old Testament theologian, the worst blasphemy is not profanity, it's lip service to God. And that kind of hits close to home, because how many times do we even pray flippantly? How many times do we go through our song service here on Sunday mornings and just kind of go through the motions and we say the name of God, but we're not really there? And how many times, I think about this, because Jesus mentioned this, that your mouth honors God, your lips honor God, but your heart is far from him. And so that really kind of gets into like we can go through the motions and not really have our heart in this. And then we misuse God's name, which is a serious thing. But it's also this. Notice verses 8 through 11. It says, remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. You must have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your livestock, and any foreigners living among you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and everything in them. But on the seventh day he rested. That is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart as holy. Now, Kyle is actually going to talk about this in a couple of weeks, about honoring God with your time. But I'll be honest with you, I used to be that guy that would say, yes, the 10 Commandments are binding, except that Sabbath thing. That's old-fashioned. That was then. This is now. And I used to be the guy that would say, I will sleep when I die. And so let me tell you what my Sundays used to be. This is how much I did not rest. I would preach 3 sermons on a Sunday morning. I would get a bite to eat when I got home. I would immediately watch my sermon from that morning and grade myself and critique myself and beat myself up. And once I was done doing that, I would open up all of my study material for the next week's sermon. Guess what happened? I crashed and burned. And I had a counselor say that drive is good, but overdrive will kill you. And so I really kind of set out to understand Sabbath and that principle and the gift of rest that God has given us. And folks, I read an incredible book called An Unhurried Life, written by a pastor who actually went to New Mexico to a monastery up in the Pecos and spent a month there to figure out how to live a slower paced life. Recently read a book called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. And one of the things that I've figured out through this journey is that you cannot go at an unsustainable pace for 6 days and truly rest on the seventh, that it will influence the entire way you go about your life. And so basically it comes down to honoring God, not just in how we speak, but also in how we view time and how we spend our time and how time is important and finite, and we use that to glorify God. And so when you look at the first 4 commandments, this is kind of an interesting sort of thing. God is giving guardrails for people becoming a people. And what he lays out in these guardrails right here is really kind of interesting. In fact, he sums it up in Deuteronomy chapter 6. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. And basically what it comes down to is you got to love God with all you got. And this is what it looks like to love God with all you got. And so basically what we find here is God provides guardrails for us to love and worship Him fully. Now, there's a lot more to this, and God will kind of expand on this. In fact, Jim next week will actually talk about worship, or actually in a couple of weeks, he'll talk about worship and how God made that such a huge priority. But part of worshiping God, part of the honoring God with our life is how we treat one another, how we treat people. And so what we find in verse 12 is this: honor your father and mother, then you will live a long, full life in the land your God is giving you. So this is a tough command, and maybe the toughest command, because here's the thing. There's a lot of crappy parents out there. There really are. And I've talked with a lot of people that really struggle with honor when it comes to parents, because their parents were lousy. And I've heard people say, well, you had good parents. And so it's easy to honor them. It's easy to go about your life in some way to honor them. And, and if it's not that they were crappy parents, they're sinful parents. Every parent, even Joseph and Mary, there I said it, were sinful. And so here's the reality. Because we're sinful as parents we are sinful, we're going to make mistakes raising our kids. We just are. In fact, one of the best conversations we've had with our adult kids, I can't remember how this came about, but all of our adult kids were home, and we were sitting around the living room, and we were talking about things in the past. And I don't know if Tara started it or if I started it, actually how it came out, but we basically said, listen, we made mistakes as your parents. And honestly, if we were to go back, in fact, Tara and I have had a lot of conversation about this. If we were to go back and be able to parent again, these are like 4 or 5 things, big things that we would do differently. We can't go back and change that. So we apologized to our kids and said, in 20 years when you're in counseling, know that we're sorry, right? It was kind of that. And so that's the reality. But notice it says here, honor your parents, not obey your parents. And honor is a word that oftentimes is dedicated to God. And so I think it's easier to obey because we have a check mark of a yes or a no. I did good or I didn't do good. Honor's more esoteric, and it's a heart issue. It's an attitude issue. It's also an action issue. It plays out in how we talk about our parents, how we talk to our parents, how we care for our parents. Now, there's a lot of that. In fact, my brother and we're kind of at a time, and in fact, in a couple of weeks, I'm not going to be there. My brother lives close to my parents and so on, but we're signing power of attorney type stuff. It comes with caring for your parents and making sure that's and so it's so multifaceted. But it comes down to how we treat people. And how we treat people is really how we treat people in our family many times. And so verse 13, though, easy. If you like to memorize Scripture, here's an easy one. You must not murder. Okay? This is taking a life out of anger or retaliation. It's pretty cut and dry. You either did or you didn't. And there's times where people accidentally do that, but this is talking about intentional type murder. And it really kind of is the value of life here. And so most of us can look at this and go, okay, good, right? I'm all right here. But here's the reality. Jesus, when he was preaching, his very first sermon said, you may have heard that it was said, do not murder, but I tell you. And he ups the ante here. And he talks about having hate in your heart and anger for your brother or toward another person. Verbal abuse. It's kind of a recent term, but pointing to that. Comments that disparage one another. I'll even go as far as to say this, the unwillingness to forgive another person. And Jesus says, listen, if you got all of that going on, you've committed murder. You're guilty. And so that kind of changes the tune here. Very next one, you must not commit adultery. In verse 14, again, cut and dry. One of those things you can give yourself thumbs up, thumbs down, right? But then again, Jesus said, you've heard that it was said, do not commit adultery, but I tell you. And he said, if you even look at a person of the opposite sex with intent and imagination, you're guilty. And so at some point in time, that's going to happen in everyone's life. But I think Jesus is really kind of talking about valuing marriage, guarding your marriage, putting boundaries in your marriage, making sure, and this is kind of a big thing today, especially with social media and texting and different things like that, not talking to somebody of the opposite sex about something that you would only talk to your spouse about. In fact, there's a thing called an emotional affair. And I've watched this happen time and time and time again, but it's basically you're giving people attention and loyalty and not necessarily physical affection, but your heart and your mind more than you are your spouse. So it's guarding your marriage. Notice verse 15, you must not steal. And I actually thought about this passage here and think about you must not steal. And getting to the heart of this, and it's interesting, last week we talked about how God sent manna and quail to provide for his people. But I'm going to throw out a couple of things, pull out a couple of items this morning that I think are vitally important when we talk about what God did there. Number one, he taught them how to trust him with their daily needs. Like they were forced to understand that my provision, the good things in life come from God. And stealing is wanting something for nothing and understanding that every good and perfect gift is from God. But there's a couple other items here that are very interesting. They weren't allowed to take more than what they needed for that day except in preparation for the Sabbath. And so there's that idea. How many of us are content with just having enough food for today? But then there's also this. Each person, or I'm going to say each family, was responsible for going out and collecting the manna and quail each day. You couldn't have somebody do it for you. And basically what we're finding here is good responsibility with our life, that we understand God is our provider, but there's a personal responsibility on our part to gather and to not be selfish with that. And so that's kind of a big thing. And now we get into verse 16. You must not testify falsely against your neighbor. So I know that there's a couple lawyers in the house today. And so you'll understand this was originally aimed at perjury, that you are not allowed to perjure yourself in a court of law where you testified falsely about what your neighbor did or did not do. But what we find is this kind of becomes an interpersonal relationship that we speak truth. Now, speaking truth is one aspect of this, but also it's protecting the character of another person. And when we protect the character of another person, how many times have you taken part in a conversation that disparaged the character of another or gossiped about another? In fact, in James chapter 3, Jesus' little brother says that the tongue is uncontrollable, and an uncontrollable tongue is the most dangerous weapon in the world. And so it comes to even more, do we value people when we speak? And then we get to this, the last command. You must not covet your neighbor's house. You must not covet your neighbor's wife, male or female servant, ox or donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. This is speaking to this desire that things will give you value, that things in many ways will make life better. I had an experience that happened about a month and a half ago. Our house was struck by lightning. We had one of those wax warmers on our pellet stove, since we're not running a pellet stove, that makes the house smell good. It exploded everywhere. anything that was on in the west side of my house, lights, which thankfully not very many, modem, TV, soundbar, all gone, obliterated. And my stupid home warranty said, no, it's only for power surges and not power surges through lightning. But I had been saving up for a new TV. Golden opportunity. So I got a slight, substantial upgrade to my TV. I am no happier today than I was a month and a half ago. But we are convinced, right? We are convinced that this will bring value to our lives. And I'll even go as far as to say when we start looking at our neighbor, our friend, or our brother, or a coworker that has more than us or has different than us, it develops envy, and envy becomes contempt, and it is impossible to love your neighbor when you have contempt for them. And what this is really all about is loving your neighbor as yourself. In fact, you talk about the first four, it's about how to fully love and worship God. The last six, God provides guardrails for us to love and value people. That's really what it's about. In fact, so what we have here is we have a relationship with God, and God sets boundaries and guardrails for that. But we also live among people. And, I've heard it said by other pastors, and I may have said this a time or two in my life, the church would be perfect if it weren't for people. Okay? Because people are the worst. Right? And we're all the worst. We are all sinful, and we have our things, and it's hard to get along with people. And so what God does is He provides boundaries and guardrails for this. And, so the first four are really about Him. The last six is about other people. So we love God and we love people. And so what God does here, and this is our bottom line, God provides guardrails, God's standard for His people is clear but impossible. If I sat and listened today, and if you were with me in study, I'm going through study going, yeah, this is not a list and it's not a checklist, but if this were a checklist, and if this were if this were baseball batting average, I am batting 0 here. And all of us are. And that's kind of the point. In fact, especially when we bring Jesus' interpretation into this. In fact, I love what the Apostle Paul does in Romans chapter 3, where he says this, "For no one can ever be made right with God by doing what the law commands." Basically, because we can't. The law simply shows us how sinful we are. The law shows us how much we stink at stinking. Okay, we just can't live up. In fact, according to Paul, that's the point, is to be able to say, listen, the law just reveals our sinfulness. In fact, in Romans 7, he's like, I would not have known it was a sin to covet if God had not said it's a sin to covet. And so when God says it's a sin to covet, all it does is put a spotlight on my sin. In fact, I love Romans 7. Romans 7 is probably the most humiliating, I am such a scumbag chapter in the entire Bible, which is followed by Romans 8, which is the greatest chapter that Paul ever wrote. But you cannot have Romans 8 without Romans 7, because in Romans 7, Paul is like, you know what? I really want to do good. And the bad that that's what I don't want to do. But the good that I want to do, I don't do that. And the bad that I don't want to do, that's what I end up doing. And so he ends with this in Romans 7:24. He says, "Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death?" Now, there's opinions out there, and there are various opinions out there. So there are some theologians that say, yes, this is in fact the case, and others that say, no, this is not. So if it's not, it's still a very good illustration. Many theologians believe that the Romans were experts in execution, hence the cross. But it wasn't their only form of execution. There was also what an execution that they called the body of death. And I don't want to be ooh and gross to anybody here today, but there was this form of execution that if you were convicted of murder, they would take the body of the person that you killed, and they would tie it to you hand to hand, foot to foot, body to body, and face to face, and they would throw you in the landfill, basically. And you had to die. Starvation, elements, thirst, all the while staring at this body of death. And so Paul, thinking of his sin, he says, who will rescue me from this body of death? My sin is always before me. And so I ask you, who will deliver you from the body of death? This is what we find in Acts chapter 4, verse 12. There is no salvation. There is salvation in no one else. God has given us no other name under heaven by which we must be saved. Only Jesus can rescue you from the body of death. You can't pray enough. You can't give enough. You can't invite enough people to church. You can't evangelize enough. You can't do anything that is enough to tip the scales in your favor. The scales are always against you. And let me share that I'm going to share something about the East Mountains. Old data, and I think this is conservative data. There are thousands of people in the East Mountains that are not walking with Jesus. There are thousands of people. In fact, when you go to Walmart and you go to Smith's and you go to work and you go to ball games for your kids, I'm going to throw this out, and I'll mention this here in a few moments in our head, heart, and hands. 3 out of every 4 people you see are not following Jesus. They're skeptical, they're hurt, they're disoriented, they're just trying to get through another day, but they're carrying around a body of death, and many have no earthly idea that they're carrying around a body of death. And I believe that Valley View is here for a very, very specific purpose. In fact, I believe our purpose as a church is very simple. It's this: to help people know Jesus and to help people live for Jesus. The Great Commission that Jesus talked about, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Help people know me. That's really what he was saying in a nutshell. And then teach them to obey everything I've commanded you. Help them to live for me. And so if that's our mission as a church, that's your mission. And so when I say that 3 out of 4 people that we come across are not following Jesus, I actually think that's probably 4 out of 5. Statistics would say, yeah, this is the case, but I'm not so certain. And so I'm going to ask this question here today. Does your heart break for people who do not follow Jesus? Does your heart break when you hear marriages crumbling and families crumbling and lives crumbling because there's no walk with Jesus? Should it break our hearts? I mean, it should. But I'm going to be honest with you. I mean, I asked this question, and I don't know how I'm going to answer this at any given time, but there are times my heart does not break for people. Jesus' heart? I mean, he wept over Jerusalem. I believe Jesus' heart is breaking for people who do not know him. And if it breaks his heart, it ought to break ours. And by virtue of this, because of this, we get to live life on mission. We get to live life, in fact, all of us, whether it be our spouse, whether it be our kids, our neighbor, our coworker, our friends, we get to live life on mission by helping people know and love and know and live for Jesus. And listen, I want to put something very tangible before us here this morning. This coming Friday, Halloween, we're going to be having a trunk or treat here at the church. We're going to be handing out candy to a bunch of kids and probably adults that don't need candy. All right? That's what we're going to be doing. And every time we do this, I get emails. Every time we do this, I get questions. And so I'm just going to tell you, I'm not a big fan of Halloween. Never have been. Even as a little kid, I was like, this is kind of stupid. And then when we had kids and we had to buy costumes, and it's like, all I saw was dollar signs. And then I really thought it was stupid. And I was a grump. I'm not a big fan of Halloween, but I will tell you this. I'm a huge fan of people who don't know Jesus. And if we can have an opportunity to connect with people that we might not ordinarily connect with, we need to set some of our whatever aside. Love our community. Love those that we might sometime be able to have a conversation with about their body of death and how life doesn't have to be this way. Will you join me in prayer?